Have you ever sat at a family table, smiling politely, while the people who share your blood secretly plot your humiliation? I was a military rescue pilot who survived heavy artillery fire in the canyons of the Middle East. But the most dangerous ambush of my life did not happen in a war zone. It happened at my family's 4th of July barbecue, orchestrated by my own cousin. He handed me a child's toy in front of 50 guests and rolling news cameras, laughing about how I just fly medics around. He thought he had backed me into a corner. He did not know I had the actual classified combat audio in my pocket. And he certainly did not expect his own father, a legendary Navy SEAL, to step up to the microphone and destroy his entire political career in exactly 30 seconds. The lesson here is simple. True strength isn't about enduring disrespect in silence. It is about having the courage to set unbreakable boundaries, even with your own family. This story is fundamentally about reclaiming your self-worth. It is a reminder that you do not need a hero to come and validate your pain or your accomplishments. You possess the power to validate yourself. If you have ever had to stand your ground against a toxic family member, pull up a chair. Hit that like button to support women who refuse to be silenced. Share this video with someone who might desperately need to hear it today. And subscribe to our channel so we can continue to grow our chosen family together. I would love to hear how you found your own courage, so please, let me know your story in the comments below. Have you ever sat at a family dinner table, surrounded by the people who are supposed to love you most, and felt entirely invisible? Worse than that, have you ever been the punchline to a joke you did not find funny? While you're real, invisible scars throbbed quietly beneath your collar. My name is Harper Vance. I am 34 years old, a search and rescue medevac helicopter pilot in the United States Air Force. For over a decade, my life has been measured in rotor wash, the smell of jet fuel, and the desperate, frantic minutes between life and death. But returning home to Ohio for my family's annual 4th of July weekend felt like stepping onto a battlefield far more treacherous than the deserts of the Middle East. Here, the landmines were not buried in the sand. They were hidden in passive-aggressive smiles, loaded questions, and the suffocating weight of my family's expectations. The Midwestern summer heat hung thick and heavy over my Uncle Mitchell's sprawling estate. Mitchell was a retired Navy SEAL legend, a man whose shadow loomed large over our entire town. His medal sat in velvet cases in his mahogany study, and his reputation as a stoic, unflinching patriot was the bedrock of the Vance family legacy. I respected my uncle deeply, but his silence had always been his most destructive weapon. He was a man of few words, which meant he rarely intervened when his son, my cousin, Connor, decided to suck the oxygen out of every room. Connor was the golden boy. He was a charismatic, aggressively confident real estate developer who had recently decided to run for city council. His entire political platform was built on traditional values and riding the coattails of his father's military glory. Connor had never served a day in uniform, but he wore patriotism like a designer suit, perfectly tailored to make him look much braver than he actually was. From the moment I arrived, the microaggressions began. I had just returned from a grueling, highly classified deployment in Yemen. I was exhausted to my very bones, struggling with the kind of insomnia that leaves you staring at the ceiling, listening for the phantom sound of artillery fire, instead of offering a quiet space to decompress. My family offered interrogations, while the men were praised for their careers. My aunts and cousins corners me in the kitchen, asking when I was going to settle down, find a nice man, and give up this dangerous phase of my life. Connor, of course, was the loudest of them all. He treated my military career as a cute, temporary hobby. To him, I was not a combat veteran. I was just his slightly masculine cousin who played with expensive government aircraft. The tension began to quietly escalate 3 days before the big barbecue. I was sitting on the back porch, staring out at the manicured lawn, trying to ground myself. I had been attending EMDR therapy at the local VA hospital to deal with the traumatic memories of my last extraction mission. The therapist told me I needed to establish firm boundaries, to stop shrinking myself to accommodate the fragile egos of the men in my family. As I sipped my coffee, the mail carrier dropped a stack of envelopes on the patio table. Among the glossy campaign flyers for Connor's election was a thick, official envelope from the Department of Defense, heavily stamped with red classified markers. It was addressed to me. Before I could reach it, Connor walked out, snatching the mail up with his usual arrogant smirk. He flipped through the pile, pausing when he saw the government seal on my letter. His eyes narrowed, a glint of predatory curiosity flashing across his face. He held it up to the light, noting the official warning stamps. Trouble with the brass. "Harper," he asked, his voice dripping with faux concern. "Did you crash one of their expensive toys? I hear they demote you pretty fast for negligence." I calmly reached out and pulled the envelope from his grip. "It is administrative, Connor, not that it is any of your business." He chuckled, a dry, condescending sound that made my jaw clench. "Right. Administrative. Just remember, the press is coming to the barbecue on Saturday for my campaign launch. Dad is giving a speech for me. Try not to bring any of your Air Force drama to the yard. We need the family looking perfect, not like a rehabilitation center for washed-up pilots." He turned and walked back into the house, leaving me alone with the summer breeze. He did not know that the envelope in my hands did not contain a reprimand. He did not know the blood that had been shed to earn the document inside. And he certainly did not know that his relentless need to belittle me was about to trigger an avalanche that would bury his pristine, manufactured reputation. I looked at the letter, feeling the familiar, icy calm of a pilot entering a storm. I was done being the peacekeeper. If Connor wanted a show for the cameras, I was finally ready to give him one. The morning of the 4th of July barbecue dawned bright, cloudless, and painfully humid. The backyard of Uncle Mitchell's estate was transformed into a picturesque slice of Americana, red, white, and blue bunting draped across the oak trees. Catering staff moved smoothly through the crowd with silver trays, and local news crews set up their cameras near the grand patio. Connor was in his element, shaking hands, kissing babies, and projecting the image of a steadfast community leader. I wore a simple navy blue dress, standing near the edge of the garden, watching the spectacle with a detached, clinical observation. But I had not come to this party completely unprepared. Earlier that morning, I had walked into Uncle Mitchell's private study. He was polishing his dress shoes, the silence between us heavy and suffocating. I did not yell, and I did not cry. I simply placed a small piece of jagged, twisted metal on his pristine desk, a piece of shrapnel that had been pulled from my shoulder a month prior. "I don't care if Connor respects me, Uncle Mitchell," I had told him, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "But if you stand by today and let him humiliate me in front of those cameras to boost his political campaign, you will lose me forever. I am drawing a line. You can choose to protect your son's fragile ego, or you can choose the truth. But you cannot have both." Mitchell had stared at the shrapnel, his jaw tight, his eyes reflecting a deep, haunting guilt. He had said nothing as I walked out, leaving him alone with his conscience. By mid-afternoon, the crowd gathered around the patio for the main event. Connor tapped a microphone, smiling brightly as the cameras rolled. He spoke about family values, the importance of military legacy, and his vision for the city. The crowd applauded, hanging on to his every word. Then his eyes locked onto me, and that familiar, malicious smirk crept across his face. "Of course, service comes in many forms," Connor announced, his voice echoing through the speakers. "We even have our very own family chauffeur here, my cousin Harper." He reached behind the podium and pulled out a brightly colored, plastic toy helicopter, holding it up like a trophy. The crowd offered a few awkward chuckles. "Harper flies the medics around. We are so proud of her. In fact, she just got a very serious letter from the Defense Department. Probably a parking ticket for landing in the wrong spot. But hey, someone has to go save the kittens out of the trees." "Right, Laughter rippled through the guests. It was the same old joke, the same tired belittlement. But this time, I did not look down. I did not shrink. I walked straight up to the patio, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. I bypassed Connor entirely, pulling my phone from my pocket. I connected it to the Bluetooth receiver on the massive outdoor speaker system. The backyard fell dead silent, confused by my sudden interruption. I pressed play on an unclassified, raw audio file I had saved from my last extraction. Instantly, the serene suburban afternoon was shattered by the deafening, chaotic sound of heavy machine gun fire, static and screaming. Through the speakers, a desperate, terrified male voice cracked over the comms. "We are pinned down, taking heavy RPG fire. We have 2 men bleeding out. We need immediate evac. Does anyone copy?" Connor's face went pale. The reporters lowered their notebooks. Then another voice cut through the chaos on the audio track. It was my voice, eerily calm, cutting through the gunfire like a blade. "This is medevac actual. We are taking fire, but we are holding the ridge. I repeat, Stonewall is holding the ridge. Keep your heads down. Boys, I am coming to get you." I stopped the audio. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than the summer humidity. Connor nervously adjusted his collar, trying to salvage his moment. "Well, that's a nice Hollywood soundbite. Harper, but shut up. Connor." The voice boomed across the patio like thunder. It was Uncle Mitchell. He stepped out from the shadows of the porch, his face hardened into stone. He walked directly past his son and stood beside me, facing the flashing cameras. "My son is a fool," Mitchell said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and profound shame. "And I have been a coward for letting his arrogance go unchecked. That audio you just heard wasn't a movie. That was the Kunar province, 6 weeks ago." Mitchell turned his gaze to the crowd, tears brimming in his fierce, weathered eyes. "The SEAL team that was pinned down in that canyon was led by my youngest godson, Ethan. They were surrounded, out of ammunition, and waiting to die. The military told them the airspace was too hot for a rescue. But the pilot who ignored those orders, the pilot who flew her Black Hawk through a storm of rocket fire, took shrapnel to the shoulder, and held that ridge until every single one of those men was loaded aboard. That was Harper." Mitchell placed a trembling hand on my shoulder. "Her call sign is Stonewall, and she is twice the man anyone else in this family will ever be." The cameras flashed blindingly. Connor stood frozen, his political career dissolving into ash right before his eyes. I looked at the crowd, feeling the heavy, suffocating armor I had worn for years finally crack and fall away. I didn't need their applause, and I didn't need Connor's ruin to feel whole. I had simply demanded the truth, and in doing so, I had finally set myself free. The immediate aftermath of Uncle Mitchell's confession was not an explosion of noise, but a suffocating, echoing vacuum. For a fraction of a second, the entire backyard was frozen in a collective state of shock. Then, the frantic clicking of camera shutters broke the spell. Reporters who had been invited to document the rise of a promising new political star suddenly found themselves front row at the dismantling of a local dynasty. Connor's face drained of all its color, leaving him looking sickly and hollow beneath the festive string lights. He opened his mouth, stammering, desperately trying to construct a lifeline out of thin air. He reached for the microphone, his hands visibly shaking. But before he could utter a single word of spin, the lead reporter from the local news station stepped forward, completely ignoring him, and pointed her microphone directly at me. The narrative had shifted irrevocably, and Connor was no longer the main character in his own manufactured story. I did not stay to watch him drown. I had no desire to revel in his public humiliation. Nor did I want to answer the breathless questions of the journalists swarming the patio. I turned my back on the flashing cameras, the whispering guests, and the remnants of the all-American barbecue, and walked quietly toward the house. The heavy glass sliding door clicked shut behind me, instantly muting the chaos of the yard. The sudden quiet of the empty house felt like stepping into a sanctuary. I walked up the hardwood stairs to the guest bedroom, pulling my duffel bag from the closet. As I began to fold my clothes, I realized my hands were completely steady. For years, I had craved this exact moment, the moment my family would finally see me, acknowledge my sacrifices, and validate my worth. Yet now that the truth was out in the open, I felt strangely detached. I did not feel victorious. I only felt an overwhelming, profound sense of exhaustion and a deep yearning to return to the sky, where the rules were simple and gravity was the only force trying to pull me down. The sun had just begun to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the bedroom floor, when a heavy, hesitant knock sounded at the door. I did not look up from zipping my bag. "Come in," I said softly. The door creaked open, and Uncle Mitchell stepped into the room. Without the confident posture he usually maintained, he looked suddenly frail, an old man weighed down by decades of his own making. He stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. For a long time, the only sound between us was the distant, muffled hum of the reporter's vans idling in the driveway. He looked at my packed bag, then at the floor, struggling to find the words he had spent his entire life avoiding. "The press is having a field day out there," Mitchell finally murmured, his voice rough and uneven. Connor locked himself in his office. His campaign manager just drove away. He paused, taking a ragged breath. "Harper, I don't know how to begin to make this right. I let my pride, and my blind spot for my son, turn me into a monster. I watched him tear you down, day after day, because it was easier than forcing him to face his own mediocrity. You saved Ethan. You saved my godson. And in return, I let you bleed in front of the people who should have been your safe harbor." He slowly pulled his hand from his pocket and held it out toward me. Resting in his weathered palm was a solid, gold Navy SEAL trident, his own challenge coin, the one he had carried since his time in the teams. It was the highest honor he could bestow, a silent plea for absolution. I looked at the trident, then up at his tear-filled eyes. I reached out and gently took the heavy metal coin, feeling its cold edges against my skin. "I appreciate this, Uncle Mitchell. I really do," I said, my voice gentle but resolute. "And I forgive you. Carrying anger toward you is a weight I am no longer willing to carry." A brief flicker of relief crossed his face, but I held up my hand, stopping him before he could step closer. "But forgiveness does not mean access. You do not get to wipe the slate clean with a grand gesture and pretend the last 10 years did not happen. You allowed your home to become a place where I was emotionally abused, and you provided the audience for it. I love you, Uncle Mitchell, but I am leaving tonight, and you are going to have to earn your seat at my table." Mitchell nodded slowly, tears finally spilling over his weathered cheeks. He understood. There would be no cinematic embrace, no sweeping musical swell to fix the broken pieces of our family. I slung my duffel bag over my shoulder, walked past him, and descended the stairs. When I started my car in the driveway, I did not look back at the grand estate. I put the car in drive and pulled away, the evening wind rushing through the open windows, clearing the suffocating air of the past and making way for the terrifying, beautiful silence of the future. The fallout from the 4th of July barbecue was swift and merciless. By Tuesday morning, the video of Uncle Mitchell's confession had gone entirely viral, spreading far beyond the local Ohio news stations. Connor's carefully curated image as the rugged, patriotic hometown hero evaporated overnight. The internet was unforgiving, branding him as the epitome of fragile masculinity and stolen valor. His political campaign was suspended indefinitely, his donors quietly pulling their funding within 48 hours. I heard all of this through voicemails from my frantic aunts and cousins, most of whom were suddenly desperate to tell me how proud they had always been of me. I listened to their messages with a detached, mild amusement, and then I systematically blocked their numbers. I had traded the battlefield of my family's dinner table for the actual flight line at my base in New Mexico, and the desert air had never tasted sweeter. 3 months later, I was standing on the blistering tarmac under the relentless western sun, watching a new class of medevac trainees run through their pre-flight checks. I had been promoted to a training commander, tasked with shaping the next generation of search and rescue pilots. Among them was a young woman named Sarah, a brilliant pilot who still flinched when the male recruits spoke over her in briefings. During a break, I found her sitting alone behind a hangar, staring at her boots. Clearly overwhelmed by the pressure of proving she belonged, I sat down next to her, handing her a bottle of water. I did not give her a speech about grit or military toughness. I simply told her about the plastic helicopter my cousin had handed me, about the silence of my uncle, and about the day I realized that no amount of medals would ever make the wrong people respect me. I watched her posture change, the tension melting from her shoulders as she realized she did not have to carry the burden of their sexism. She just had to fly. If you are listening to this right now, I need you to pause and really hear what I am about to say. I need you to look at your own life, at your own family tables, and ask yourself a very hard question. If there is one profound truth I want you to take away from my story, it is this: your worth is not, and never will be, defined by the people who are too blind to see it. For years, I allowed my family's deeply ingrained patriarchal views to shrink me. I genuinely believed that if I just worked a little harder, if I just saved enough lives, if I bled enough for my country, they would eventually have no choice but to respect me. But true equality, true human dignity, does not require a resume. You do not need to fly a Black Hawk helicopter through a canyon of rocket fire for your family to treat you with basic, fundamental human decency. As women, we are conditioned from childhood to be the peacekeepers. We are taught to swallow the insults along with our dinner, to laugh off the sexist jokes so we do not seem difficult, to minimize our own grand accomplishments so we do not threaten the fragile egos of the men around us. We mistake suffering in silence for strength, but let me be perfectly clear. Emotional abuse masquerading as family banter is still abuse. Gaslighting wrapped in traditional values is still toxic. Healing truly begins the moment you realize you do not need a savior to come and validate your pain. I did not need my Uncle Mitchell to step to that microphone to make me a hero. I needed to validate myself. The moment I confronted him in that study, the moment I drew a firm, unshakable line in the sand, was the moment I truly became Stonewall. Compassion, love, and forgiveness are beautiful, necessary things, but they must absolutely be paired with ironclad boundaries. You have the fundamental human right to walk away from toxic tables. You have the right to demand respect, and you have the power to leave when it is not given. Before we part ways today, I want to leave you with a gentle, but urgent, warning. If you are sitting in a dynamic right now where you are constantly the butt of the joke, where your trauma is invalidated, or where your gender is used as a weapon against your competence, do not wait for a dramatic barbecue showdown to change your life. Real life rarely offers us a cinematic reveal. Sometimes, the bravest, most heroic thing you can possibly do is pack your bags quietly in the dark, seek the therapy you deserve, and build a chosen family who loves you for exactly who you are, without conditions. Have you ever had to stand up to a family member to protect your own peace? How did you finally find the courage to set that boundary? I want to read your stories in the comments below. Let's make this comment section a safe space for healing, shared strength, and mutual respect. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button. It truly helps this video reach other women who might desperately need to hear this message today. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because next week, I will be sharing another deep dive into navigating life's hardest relationships. Until then, remember, you are the sole author of your own story. Do not let anyone else hold the pen. Stay strong, ladies. The blinding sun of the New Mexican desert has a unique way of bleaching the world of its complications. Out here on the flight line at Holloman Air Force Base, there is only the searing heat, the sharp scent of aviation fuel, and the rhythmic, deafening thwack of helicopter rotors cutting through the thin air. In the months following the spectacular implosion of my family's 4th of July barbecue, I had buried myself in this austere environment, finding immense comfort in the rigid predictability of military aviation. The video of Uncle Mitchell stepping to the microphone and dismantling his own son's political career had swept across the internet like a wildfire, accumulating millions of views before anyone could figure out how to take it down. Strangers from across the globe had flooded my social media, sending messages of support, sharing their own deeply personal stories of family estrangement, gaslighting, and the heavy burden of invisible trauma. While I was deeply moved by the solidarity of so many resilient women, I had zero desire to become an internet celebrity. I was a medevac pilot, a woman whose entire career was predicated on dropping into the darkest, most chaotic places on Earth and leaving without leaving a trace. The sudden, glaring spotlight of viral fame felt incredibly unnatural, so I simply logged off, deleted the apps, and let the digital world spin on without me. However, a narcissist who has been publicly unmasked rarely retreats into the shadows gracefully. They almost always attempt to rewrite the narrative or punish the person who exposed them. Connor's retaliation arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in late October, delivered to my day's housing by a remarkably nervous courier. It was a thick, intimidating envelope from a high-powered, incredibly expensive law firm based out of Chicago. As I sat at my small kitchen table, staring at the embossed crest on the heavy cardstock, I felt a brief, familiar spike of adrenaline, the same metallic taste of anticipation I got just before dropping into a hot landing zone. I sliced the envelope open with a butter knife and unfolded the thick pages. It was a formal cease and desist letter, accompanied by a drafted, but unfiled, lawsuit for defamation of character, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and loss of prospective economic advantage. Connor's legal team was demanding a public retraction of my fabricated audio, a formal written apology, and an exorbitant sum in financial damages for ruining his city council campaign. They threatened to drag my military record through the mud and subpoena my commanding officers if I did not immediately comply. 10 years ago, the sheer weight of this legal threat would have sent me spiraling into a panic attack. I would have called my mother, begged for advice, and likely caved to the pressure just to keep the peace. But the woman sitting at that kitchen table was Stonewall. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, read through the legal jargon a second time, and actually laughed out loud. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of Connor attempting to use the justice system to bully me back into submission was almost comical. He had fundamentally misunderstood the game he was playing. He thought he was dealing with the quiet, compliant cousin who used to fix lawnmowers in the backyard. He did not realize that a woman who has stared down rocket-propelled grenades in the Kunar province is not going to be intimidated by a piece of paper signed by a man in a tailored suit. Instead of panicking, I picked up my phone and called Diane. Diane was a former military judge, advocate general, a JAG officer, who had recently transitioned into ruthless private practice. She was a fiercely intelligent, no-nonsense woman in her late 50s who possessed a razor-sharp wit and a complete intolerance for foolish men. I scanned the documents, emailed them to her secure server, and waited exactly 15 minutes before my phone rang. Diane was already chuckling when I answered. She explained that the lawsuit was entirely frivolous, a classic slap suit designed purely to intimidate me. The absolute defense to defamation is the truth, and we had the truth fully documented and witnessed by dozens of reporters and a highly decorated Navy SEAL. Diane told me to focus on my trainees and leave Connor to her. 2 days later, Diane sent a single, blistering page back to Connor's Chicago law firm. It elegantly outlined the legal definition of perjury, gently reminded them of Uncle Mitchell's willingness to testify under oath regarding the audio's authenticity, and promised a devastating countersuit for harassment and malicious prosecution if they ever contacted me again. The response was a masterclass in establishing an impenetrable boundary. We never heard from Connor's lawyers again. The threat simply evaporated into the desert air. proving once again that bullies are inherently cowards who retreat the moment they meet genuine, unyielding resistance. That piece of paper was the final chain connecting me to my cousin, and with one swift legal strike, the link was permanently severed. I had successfully protected my peace, not through screaming matches or dramatic confrontations, but through cold, calculated, and legally enforced boundaries. A full year passed before the dust from the Avery family fallout completely settled, leaving behind a landscape that was entirely unrecognizable from the one I had known in my youth. The harsh, biting winter of New Mexico eventually surrendered to a spectacular, blooming spring. The desert floor, usually a canvas of cracked earth and sagebrush, erupted into a vibrant sea of wildflowers. I was in the pilot seat of my H-60 Pavehawk, running a complex high-altitude hoist training exercise with Sarah, the young female recruit I had taken under my wing. Sarah was no longer the nervous, hesitant girl hiding behind the hangars. Her voice over the internal communication system was sharp, confident, and utterly commanding. As we hovered 3,000 feet above the jagged mountain peaks, the turbulent crosswinds violently shaking the massive aircraft, Sarah executed a flawless simulated rescue hoist, pulling the dummy payload into the cabin with mechanical precision. I looked over at her from the right seat, giving her a firm, approving nod. The pride swelling in his chest was immense. I had finally realized that my true legacy was not going to be built at a family dinner table in Ohio. My legacy was sitting right beside me in the cockpit, multiplying with every young woman I taught to conquer the sky. We brought the helicopter back to the base, the heavy tires kissing the concrete tarmac with a gentle, practiced thud, as the massive rotor blades began to slow their frantic spinning, cutting the engine noise down to a tolerable whine. I noticed a solitary figure standing near the edge of the blast fence. He was wearing faded denim jeans and a simple gray t-shirt, leaning casually against the chain-link fence with his hands tucked into his pockets. Even from a distance, the rigid, perfectly balanced posture of a special operator was unmistakable. As I climbed out of the cockpit, pulling off my heavy flight helmet and shaking out my hair, the man walked out onto the tarmac to meet me. It was Ethan. He was Uncle Mitchell's godson, the young Navy SEAL team leader whose life I had pulled from the jaws of the canyon in Yemen. We had not seen each other since that terrifying, blood-soaked night. As we closed the distance, there was no need for grand, theatrical greetings. We simply stopped a few feet apart, the warm desert wind sweeping between us. I noticed a thick, jagged scar running up the side of his neck, disappearing beneath the collar of his shirt, a permanent, physical reminder of the price he had paid for our country. Ethan looked at me, his eyes dark, intense, and filled with a profound, unspoken gratitude that immediately brought a lump to my throat. He did not offer me a medal, a certificate, or a sweeping public speech. Instead, he reached out and pulled me into a fierce, solid embrace. It was the embrace of a brother in arms, a pure, unadulterated acknowledgement of shared survival. When he finally pulled back, he offered me a quiet, devastatingly simple smile. "Stonewall," he murmured, his voice rough. It took me way too long to find my way out to the desert to say thank you. We spent the afternoon sitting on the tailgate of my truck, drinking cheap black coffee from styrofoam cups and watching the sun begin its slow, magnificent descent over the mountains. Ethan filled me in on the quiet, agonizingly slow reconstruction of Uncle Mitchell. My uncle had not tried to force his way back into my life. Instead, he had taken my words to heart. He had started attending intense therapy at the VA to dismantle his own toxic views on masculinity and parenting. He had formally disinherited Connor and stepped away from all public life, choosing to live quietly, tending to his property and volunteering at a local veterans shelter. Mitchell was doing the incredibly hard, unglamorous work of genuine repentance, without demanding an audience to applaud his growth. As for Connor, his political ambitions were dead, his business had fractured, and he had become a ghost in his own hometown, entirely ostracized by the community he had tried to manipulate. as Ethan spoke about my cousin's downfall. I waited for the familiar rush of vindication or the bitter sting of anger, but to my absolute surprise, I felt nothing at all. There was no joy in his failure, and no lingering resentment for his cruelty. Connor had simply ceased to matter. He had been reduced to an irrelevant footnote in a life that was now overflowing with purpose, respect, and profound joy. I looked out at the massive military helicopters lined up perfectly on the tarmac, their dark silhouettes framed against an exploding sky of fiery orange and deep violet. I had survived the battlefields of the Middle East, and I had survived the infinitely more complex emotional warfare of my own bloodline. I had finally learned that family is not a biological obligation. It is a sacred title reserved only for those who fiercely protect your peace. I took a deep breath of the cooling desert air, entirely weightless, utterly untethered, and finally, completely free. Healing is rarely a linear process. It does not follow the clean, predictable trajectory of a helicopter ascending into a cloudless sky. Instead, it is a quiet, deliberate architecture. It requires you to clear away the debris of your past, to dig deep into the uncomfortable earth of your trauma, and to pour your foundation entirely on your own terms. 2 years after I walked away from my family's 4th of July barbecue, the empty space that had once been occupied by their suffocating expectations was now filled with something far more profound: community. I had channeled my experiences into founding a peer support initiative on base specifically tailored for female service members. We called it the Vanguard Group. It was an informal but fiercely dedicated network of women who had survived not only the grueling demands of military combat, but also the silent, insidious battles fought at their own dining room tables. We met twice a week in a converted rec room, sitting in a wide circle with awful military-issued coffee. And we did the one thing that society constantly discourages women from doing. We told the unvarnished, ugly truth. In that room, the heavy armor of military stoicism was gently unbuckled. Women in their 30s, 40s, and 50s shared stories that mirrored my own with terrifying accuracy. They spoke of the exhaustion of having to constantly prove their competence in a world designed for men. They talked about returning from deployments with invisible wounds, only to be gaslighted by families who demanded they immediately seamlessly transition back into the roles of dutiful daughters, smiling wives, or quiet peacekeepers. We dismantled the myth that setting boundaries is an act of selfishness. I watched young cadets and seasoned officers alike weep as they finally realized that the chronic guilt they carried was not a character flaw, but a heavy burden placed upon them by a society that thrives on female compliance. We taught each other how to say the word no as a complete sentence. We practiced walking away from conversations designed to diminish us for the first time in my entire life. I was surrounded by a family that did not require me to shrink myself in order to be loved. I was finally seen, not as a political prop or a convenient punchline, but as a deeply flawed, fiercely resilient human being. It was during this season of profound personal growth that the past reached out one final time. But it did not arrive with the loud, aggressive arrogance of a lawsuit. It arrived in a small, unassuming manila envelope, forwarded to my base address from Ohio. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, the sharp, slanted script of Uncle Mitchell, for a moment. Holding that package, a faint echo of the old anxiety fluttered in my chest. I took it out to the back porch of my housing unit, letting the warm desert breeze ground me before I carefully tore the flap open. Inside, there was no demand for reconciliation, no emotional manipulation, and no attempt to rewrite history. There was only a handwritten letter and a printed receipt. The letter was brief, steady, and utterly devoid of excuses. Mitchell wrote that he was continuing his therapy at the VA and that the process of dismantling his own ego had been the most grueling deployment of his life. He told me that Connor had officially moved out of state, their relationship permanently fractured by Mitchell's refusal to continue funding Connor's toxic lifestyle. But the most impactful part of the letter was the final paragraph. "Harper, I am not writing this to ask for your forgiveness. nor am I asking for a place in your life. You earned your peace, and I have no right to disturb it. I am writing simply to tell you that you were right. Silence in the face of cruelty is complicity. I spent my life defending this country, but I failed to defend the woman who saved my own blood. I am trying to become a man who deserves to hold the trident you handed back to me. Tucked behind the letter was a receipt for a massive, anonymous financial donation made directly to the Vanguard Group. He had funded our support initiative for the next 5 years. I folded the letter, a quiet tear slipping down my cheek. It was not a tear of grief, but of genuine, absolute closure. Mitchell was doing the work. He was healing in his own time, and I was healing in mine. And the beautiful truth was that we could both achieve our redemption without ever needing to cross paths again. The culmination of my military career arrived not with a grand ceremony or a chest full of shiny new medals, but in the quiet, rhythmic solitude of the cockpit. It was a crisp, brilliantly clear morning in late November, the sky over the New Mexico desert stretching out in an infinite, uninterrupted expanse of a vibrant blue. I was sitting in the pilot seat of my NH-60 Pavehawk, the massive twin engines humming with a deep, reassuring power. Sarah, my former trainee, who was now my fully qualified co-pilot, sat to my right, running through the pre-flight checklist with the sharp, effortless confidence of a woman who completely owned her space. We were preparing for a routine, high-altitude medical transport, a far cry from the chaotic, blood-soaked canyons of Yemen, but carrying the exact same fundamental purpose. As I gently pulled back on the cyclic, the helicopter lifted off the tarmac, severing its connection to the earth and ascending smoothly into the thin, cold air, looking down at the shrinking world beneath me. I finally understood the true weight of the call sign I had been given. For a long time, I had thought that being Stonewall meant being impervious to pain. I thought it meant building a fortress around my heart, turning myself into something hard and unfeeling so that the careless words of men like Connor could simply bounce off me. But true strength is not about building a wall to lock the world out. A real stone wall is a foundation. It is a structure designed to protect the vulnerable space behind it, to create a safe, quiet sanctuary where new life can actually take root and grow. I had built my wall, and behind it, I had cultivated a life of profound peace, deep female friendships, and unshakable self-respect. The girl who had stood awkwardly in the backyard of an Ohio barbecue, desperate for a sliver of validation from a family that refused to see her, was gone. In her place was a woman who trusted the wind, who knew the exact value of her own soul, and who would never, ever let anyone negotiate her worth again. If you have stayed with me until the very end of this journey, I want to look you directly in the eyes and speak to the deepest part of your heart. I want to speak to the woman who is tired, the woman who is exhausted from being the bigger person, the woman who is drained from carrying the emotional labor of her entire family. You are allowed to put the burden down. You are allowed to look at the people who share your DNA and decide that their presence in your life is too expensive for your mental health. Society will try to tell you that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, and that you must endure endless disrespect in the name of tradition. Do not listen to them. Loyalty that demands the sacrifice of your own dignity is not love. It is a hostage situation. Your truest family will never ask you to shrink yourself to fit at their table. Your truest family will pull up a larger chair, listen to your voice, and celebrate the magnificent heights you are capable of reaching. Do not wait for a dramatic rescue. Do not wait for a legendary uncle or a sudden twist of fate to swoop in and validate your pain. You must be your own Stonewall. You must be the one to declare that the cycle of disrespect ends with you. It will be terrifying, and it will be lonely at first. But the quiet that follows the storm is the most beautiful sound you will ever hear. It is the sound of your own voice, finally free to speak its truth. Thank you for holding the ridge with me, ladies. Thank you for sharing your stories, your pain, and your incredible triumphs in the comments of these videos. Keep flying high. Keep your boundaries made of steel, and never apologize for the space you take up in this world. Until next time, stay safe and stay fiercely, unapologetically yours. There is a profound, almost sacred difference between the family you are born into and the family you choose to forge in the fires of your own life. For years, I had believed that blood was an unbreakable contract, a mandatory tether that bound me to the Avery family estate in Ohio, no matter how much their words bruised my spirit. But as the years pressed on following that fateful 4th of July barbecue, the universe gently revealed a different truth. True family does not demand that you shrink to fit inside their world. True family clears a space at the table for the exact magnitude of your spirit. This realization materialized fully not in a grand ballroom or a crowded military hangar, but in a quiet, snow-dusted cabin tucked deep within the rugged San Juan Mountains of Colorado. 5 years after the night that changed my life in the Kunar province. The invitation had arrived a month prior, a simple handwritten note from Ethan, Uncle Mitchell's godson and the SEAL team leader I had pulled from the canyon. It was an invitation to a private weekend gathering, a reunion of the men who had survived that impossible night in Yemen. There would be no press, no cameras, no medals pinned to dress uniforms, and absolutely no speeches. It was just an offer to share a meal, a fire, and the quiet company of people who understood the weight of the shadows we all carried. I drove up the winding mountain pass on a Friday afternoon, the crisp, pine-scented air seeping through the vents of my truck. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, the cabin stood sturdy and welcoming against the backdrop of towering evergreens. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, a stark, beautiful contrast to the stifling humidity and performative patriotism of my uncle's backyard so many years ago. When I stepped onto the wooden porch, the front door swung open, and Garrison stood in the doorway. Garrison was the seasoned, gravel-voiced SEAL whose radio communications I had memorized in my nightmares. Those in life had flashed before his eyes. While he waited for a rescue the brass said would never come, he was in civilian clothes now, wearing a faded flannel shirt and worn-out boots, his thick beard peppered with gray. He did not say a word as I approached. He simply wrapped his massive arms around my shoulders, pulling me into an embrace that felt like a fortress, one by one. The other men stepped out from the warmth of the cabin to greet me. There was no awkwardness, no questioning of my place among them, and certainly no patronizing jokes about my gender. In their eyes, I was not Harper the quiet cousin, nor was I a political talking point. I was Stonewall, the sister who had held the sky when the earth had turned to fire beneath them. That evening, we sat around a massive, rough-hewn wooden dining table. The contrast between this dinner and the Avery family gatherings of my youth was breathtaking. At Uncle Mitchell's house, dinner had always been a battlefield of egos, a desperate clamoring for attention where my cousin Connor reigned supreme by belittling everyone else. Here, in the quiet warmth of the Colorado mountains, there was no ego. These were men who had seen the absolute worst of human nature and had chosen to cultivate deep, quiet gratitude in its wake. We passed plates of roasted meat and potatoes, the conversation flowing easily between bursts of rich, genuine laughter and moments of comfortable, reflective silence. They asked about my trainees, about Sarah, and about the Vanguard group I had founded. They listened with intent, undivided attention, their respect for my leadership radiating in every nod and question. As the night deepened and the fire in the hearth burned down to glowing embers, Ethan stood up at the head of the table. He held a simple glass of amber whiskey, the firelight catching the jagged scar on his neck. The room fell into a respectful silence. He did not give a long, poetic toast. He simply raised his glass, looking directly into my eyes with a depth of emotion that required no translation. To the brothers we left behind, Ethan said softly, his voice thick with memory, and to the sister who brought the rest of us home, we hold the ridge. The men raised their glasses in unison, their voices echoing the sentiment in a low, harmonious rumble. We hold the ridge. I raised my glass of water, a profound, overwhelming sense of peace settling into the very marrow of my bones. I had spent my entire adolescence searching for a place to belong, desperate for the validation of a bloodline that was fundamentally incapable of seeing my worth. Sitting in that cabin, surrounded by the fierce, unwavering loyalty of my chosen family, I realized I had finally found my way home. The decision to retire from active duty military service is rarely an easy one. For over 15 years, the United States Air Force had been my identity, my shield, and my sanctuary. The cockpit of a medevac helicopter had been the only place in the world where the chaotic noise of my past could not reach me. But as I approached my 40th birthday, I began to feel a profound shift in the winds of my life. I was no longer running away from the ghosts of Ohio, and I no longer needed the adrenaline of combat to prove to myself that I was strong. I had spent my career pulling broken people out of physical war zones, but I realized my true life's work was now pulling women out of the emotional war zones they fought within their own homes and careers. It was time to unlace my combat boots, pass the flight stick to the next generation, and step fully into the light of the civilian world. My final flight was a quiet, unceremonious affair, exactly as I had requested. I flew a routine training route over the vast, painted deserts of New Mexico, with Sarah sitting beside me in the pilot-in-command seat. She was no longer a trainee. She was a fiercely competent aircraft commander, her voice sharp and steady over the comms, as we banked over the jagged red mesas, the setting sun washing the cockpit in brilliant shades of gold and violet. I looked at her and felt an overwhelming wave of completion. I had done my job. The airspace was safe in her hands. When we landed and the rotors finally spun to a complete, permanent halt for me, I did not feel a sense of loss. I walked away from the flight line with my head held high, carrying the quiet certainty that my legacy was not tied to a machine, but to the indestructible boundaries and self-worth I had cultivated within myself and shared with others. In the years following my honorable discharge, the Vanguard Group transitioned from a small, on-base support circle into a massive, nationally recognized nonprofit foundation, utilizing the substantial, anonymous funding Uncle Mitchell had provided, a silent reparation that had blossomed into something beautiful. We opened retreat centers across the country. We provided trauma therapy, career transition counseling, and legal advocacy for female veterans and first responders. My days were no longer measured by the frantic scramble of a rescue alarm, but by the quiet, miraculous moments of watching women reclaim their dignity. I traveled across the country, speaking in auditoriums filled with thousands of women, sharing the story of the plastic helicopter, the painful barbecue, and the day I decided to stop letting a toxic family dictate the terms of my existence. Connor had long since faded into complete obscurity, a cautionary tale of a man whose hollow ego had collapsed under the weight of the truth. He no longer occupied a single square inch of my mental real estate. As I stand here today, looking out over the life I have painstakingly built, I am overwhelmed by the sheer, brilliant clarity of the horizon. If I could reach back through time and speak to the exhausted, 34-year-old version of myself standing on that patio in Ohio, terrified of the confrontation to come, I would tell her to take a deep breath. I would tell her that the terrifying leap into the unknown, the agonizing process of severing toxic ties and demanding absolute respect, is the price of admission to a truly beautiful life. To the women who have followed this journey, I offer you this final, enduring truth. You are the architect of your own sanctuary. You do not owe your light, your energy, or your peace to people who are committed to misunderstanding you, regardless of what title they hold in your family tree. You are allowed to outgrow the spaces that were designed to keep you small. You are allowed to lay down the heavy, rusted armor of being the bigger person and simply walk away from the battlefield altogether. Your worth is inherent, unshakable, and completely non-negotiable. Hold your ridge, protect your peace with absolute ferocity, and never, ever be afraid to fly into the terrifying, magnificent unknown. The sky is yours. It always has been. As we reach the end of Harper's journey, I want you to take a quiet moment to reflect on your own life. How many times have you swallowed your pride just to keep the peace at a holiday dinner? How many times have you allowed someone else to minimize your accomplishments, your silent trauma, or your sheer resilience, simply because they are family? Society often conditions women to be the eternal peacekeepers. We are taught to smooth over the rough edges of the men around us, to accept passive-aggressive insults disguised as harmless jokes, and to carry the heavy emotional labor of entire generations on our shoulders. We mistakenly believe that suffering in silence is a form of love or strength. But this story serves as a powerful, unyielding reminder that emotional abuse is still abuse, even when it is served on a silver platter at a family barbecue. Gaslighting, wrapped in the guise of family tradition, is still toxic. Harper's true victory was not the public humiliation of her arrogant cousin, nor was it the dramatic, tearful confession of her uncle. Her ultimate triumph was walking away from that house and never looking back. Healing truly begins the moment you realize that blood does not entitle anyone to cross your boundaries. You are not obligated to offer a seat at your table to those who refuse to respect you. If you are currently sitting in a dynamic where your voice is silenced and your worth is constantly questioned, remember Stonewall. Remember that you have the absolute right to pack your bags quietly, walk away, and build a beautiful, peaceful life entirely on your own terms. True family is not always the one you are born into. It is the one you deliberately choose, the one that honors your light without ever feeling threatened by it. Protect your peace fiercely. Set boundaries made of steel. And never apologize for the magnificent space you take up in this world. This content was meticulously researched, crafted, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful lessons and value.